Why do you speak to them in parables? So when I read this line from the gospel this week, I immediately came up with my idea for my homily, and I even told the deacons that I was going to preach all of the masses because who needs to sleep? And it might not seem apparent as to why I would think about music with that line, but hopefully after I'm finished, it will make more sense. But before I really get into it, I want to start by apologizing for taking this long to speak about liturgical music. So when I first got here, I made some changes to the music. I didn't think that they were very big changes, but they were. And I didn't communicate it well. So I apologize for that, and I will begin to explain why we're doing what we're doing now. So why is music associated with this line? Why do you speak to them in parables? Well, why does Jesus speak to us in parables? Well, because it forces us who hear the parables to sit with it. A lot of times the lesson that we are trying to be taught is not immediately obvious. And so we have to dive into the Word. We have to ponder, we have to read it over and over again to come to understand the deeper meaning that Jesus is trying to teach us. And I think about this because it would be very easy for Jesus to just sort of say, all right, everybody listen up. It's hot out here. We're in the middle of the desert. I want to go home. You want to go home. Here's the lesson that I want you to learn. And just tell him what he wants to tell him. But that wouldn't bring the point home the same way. And I think of it because when I was a kid and I needed to know how to spell a word, I would say, hey, Dad, how do you spell this word? And my dad, like a good dad, would say, well, I could tell you, but you'll remember it better if you go and look it up in the dictionary yourself. And so I would roll my eyes and walk over to the dictionary and take it off of, it was like a book, right? We didn't have phones. You had to take a book off of a shelf. It was wild. We were like cavemen. And I'd look up the word. And I don't really know if my dad just didn't know how to spell the word and he didn't want to admit it, or if he really wanted me to learn a lesson. But it's true that through that effort of going and pulling out the book and looking it up made me want to remember the word more because I don't have to go through that again. And so that gave me a better sort of understanding of the word, right? And I propose that the church's teaching on sacred music is like a parable in that it forces us to ponder more deeply what it is we're doing. It forces us at times to struggle to understand maybe the church's teaching on what she proposes for music, and it forces us to sift out that deeper meaning that the music actually gives. So, first of all, what is sacred music? Well, sacred music is music that is specifically written for use in the sacred liturgy. Right? Well, what is the sacred liturgy? Well, we're doing it right now, but it's the public work of God. Father Albert, who's in charge of the office of worship for the diocese, so he would be like the bishop's delegate for all things dealing with the liturgy, wrote an email to us recently, and he said this in it. He said, the purpose of the Mass is to worship God in the way that He asks us to worship Him. Everything we do should aim first at glorifying God and sanctifying souls, and the definitions of glorifying and sanctifying are set by the Church, not by popular opinion. All right, so we come to the liturgy, not just to do anything, but to worship God. And to worship God the way that He is asked to be worshipped. And we know how He is asked to be worshipped through the church. And so we are custodians of this liturgy, right? We didn't make it up ourselves, but we're custodians and we are to treat it with reverence. And so I want to go through some of the sort of guiding document for the liturgy which came out of the Second Vatican Council. So this was the first document that came out of the council. And I think it shows the council fathers' recognition of how important the liturgy is. right? That this is the first thing we need to work on, because if we get this wrong, then everything else goes wrong. Right? And they even say this, not directly, but it has the idea behind it in paragraph 10. So they write, "The liturgy is the summit toward which the activity of the church is directed. At the same time, it is the font from which all her powers flow." Right? So the liturgy is what everything that we do in the church is directed towards. Right? If I give some money to a hungry person, I'm doing that. It's directed towards the liturgy. Right? Anything that I do, when I hear confessions, it's directed towards coming to Mass. Right? Everything that we do is directed towards this liturgy. And at the same time, it says it's the font from which all of the church's powers flow. So the ability to respond to that movement of grace to help the hungry person comes from my participation at the liturgy. The movement of grace to get off the couch and stop watching TV to go and hear confessions comes from participation at the liturgy. Right? Everything that we do flows to and from this encounter. And the nature and the goal of the liturgy has to be kept in mind whenever we start talking about things dealing with it. Right? So what is it that we're doing here? That should guide everything else that we talk about when concerning the liturgy. And what we're doing is we are representing the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so only things that are fitting to that context belong in the liturgy. Right? And since it's important that we get this right, the church governs the celebration of the liturgies with a lot of rules. And sometimes we can get very frustrated with this, right? There's rules about, what the priest wears and what we say and what we do and when we stand and when we kneel and all the other things. All right, and this can get annoying to us at some times, but we actually really like rules. All right, how do I know this? Well, I know this because one of the things I had to fight to get off of the couch to come here tonight was I had to stop watching the replay of the Wimbledon finals. I was very, very interested in this. Actually, I started watching it a little bit before the early Mass this morning, and I told them after that Mass, I said, all right, don't tell me what happened because I didn't see the ending. We walked out, one of my altar servers said, hey, Father, Alcaraz won the second set. I said, stop it! What are you trying to do? Right? But there's a lot of rules in tennis. Right? There's rules about, where you can hit the ball and how you got to serve and all these other things. How many breaks you can take. But then there's also specific rules at Wimbledon. You have to wear solid white clothes. And I went and read the rules when I was preparing this. They are incredibly, incredibly detailed. Right? Your logo can't be too big. If you have any other color other than white, it has to be, certain size, and it can only be in certain places. It's quite amazing. Why do this? Well, it helps set a precedent. Right? It helps sort of keep things in order. And ultimately, it helps focus more on the game, right, than on all of these other sort of extra things. Right? You can't wear too flashy of an outfit, so now I'm forced to focus on what is going on the court. Right? The document goes on and says in paragraph 112 that the musical tradition of the universal church is a treasure of inestimable value, greater even than that of any other art. Right? And so if we're going to have all of these rules on the liturgy, then there's probably going to be the most rules about the thing that the church finds to be most important. Right? The music. And so we're going to have a lot of rules that govern this. It goes on to say that the treasure of sacred music is to be preserved and fostered with great care. So just a little background, right? The Second Vatican Council happened 1962 to 1965, and it was John the 23rd's wish that they have this council to try to think of ways that the church could re-engage with culture in the 20th century. Right? How to not change the teachings of the church, but format them or sort of rebrand them, you could even say, in a way that we could engage with the world. And so as they're beginning this production of these documents, it's saying very clearly, we're not here to throw everything away. We have to take with us that rich tradition that we have, and use it and take care of it, right? The treasure of sacred music is to be preserved and fostered with great care. And he even lays out, or the Council Fathers lay out ways that this is to be done. It goes on in paragraph 116 and says that the Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. Then it goes on in a later paragraph and says that in the Latin Church, the pipe organ is to be held in high esteem. For it is the traditional musical instrument which adds a wonderful splendor to the Church's ceremonies and powerfully lifts up man's mind to God and to higher things. So as it's beginning this sort of revamping of what the liturgy is going to look like, it's stating very clearly that all things being equal, we ought to be using Gregorian chant for the singing, and we ought to be using the pipe organ for our instrument. Right? And it's saying this because these two forms of music coincide more clearly with what is going on in the liturgy. Right? I remember having a conversation with someone, this was years and years ago. I think I was here my first go round. And we were talking about music and debating, and I hadn't really thought of it before, but it just kind of came out as we were talking. I said, whenever I hear Gregorian chant being sung, especially as I'm processing into Mass, I feel like I am a lamb being led to the slaughter, which is exactly what I am in that moment. Right? And it moves me much more to this way of thinking than maybe some more upbeat music would. Right? That I am a lamb being led to the slaughter, and that music that the Church proposes for our use, it sort of brings that out way more intensely. Now it does go on in both of those paragraphs to say that other kinds of sacred music are allowable. It says especially polyphony. They're no means excluded, so long as they accord with the spirit of the liturgical action. As long as they are proper to a celebration of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Which means necessarily that there are certain songs or types of music that cannot be allowed in the liturgy. Right? You will not get into my truck if you ride with me, and the radio will not come on and you hear Gregorian chant. It's not going to happen, right? I struggled to learn how to like it. I like it in the liturgy. I'm generally not going to listen to it on my own. Right? It's not proper to the action of my driving. Right? I will fall asleep. What's more proper to the action of driving is Eric Clapton and Steely Dan and Sammy Ray and the Friends, right? Like this is the kind of stuff I'm going to listen to while I'm driving, and I love it. And if you ask me my favorite song, I will tell you immediately it's Lay Down Sally by Eric Clapton. You're never going to hear it here. It doesn't fit. It's not proper. Right? It doesn't go along with the action that we are doing. Right? So style, type of music is important. But language is also incredibly important. And the document goes on and talks about this. It says, particular law remaining in force, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. Now, I was never an incredibly good student or really smart or quick to pick things up. And so I always need to make things very practical, right? And so one analogy I thought of for this was, we are Acadians, most of us in this area. And one thing I love to do is listen at times. Again, you're not going to find it all the time in my car, but at times I like to listen to Cajun music. And especially in the 2 years that I was in Church Point, and I went to Church Point Mardi Gras, not the crazy part, but the chasing of the chicken stuff. The times that I did that, I really enjoyed listening to the Cajun music in French. And the Cajun culture in those small towns that still have these traditional Mardi Gras and listen to music in the traditional language have a much richer Cajun culture than, say, we do here in Lafayette. And it's because of the language. Right? Language matters. Language and culture are tied together. And if you get rid of the language, the culture fades. Right? We saw this. When my grandparents were growing up, they didn't speak English. They went to school and they got punished because they didn't speak English, and then the French started to die out. My dad doesn't know it. It started to die out. But now you see this resurgence of people wanting to learn French because they know that it's important for our heritage. Well, the same thing is true for Latin and the church. Right? Latin is the language of the Roman Catholic Church. And if we lose that in the liturgy, we lose something of our Catholic identity. Right? And this is what the council was trying to get at. Now, it didn't say that everything had to be in Latin. In fact, it said there are particular places where it would be very helpful to use the vernacular, the mother tongue of the people, especially in the readings. Right? I really enjoyed listening to the readings today because I knew what was being said. If it would have been in Latin, I would have been sitting over there twiddling my thumbs because I wouldn't have understood it. And so there are parts that we need to hear in our own language to be able to understand it a little better. And it says that these norms being observed, it is for the competent ecclesiastical authority mentioned in Article 22 to decide whether and to what extent the vernacular is to be used. So it's saying where there are questions about these more important things, it's not up to individuals, not even the priests, to decide. It's up to the proper ecclesiastical authority, which is usually the bishops. Right? And so it's not our ability or our job to change things for our personal taste. It's for the church to decide, and then we benefit from that. So I want to close with a couple of points, and I'll try to make them brief. The first is that, I'm going to skip that one actually. The second one, which will now be the first one, comes from Cardinal Ratzinger in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. And he says this. He says, the only goal of the Exodus is shown to be worship, which can only take place according to God's measure. Remember, when the chosen people are asking to go to offer sacrifice to God, Pharaoh's like, all right, you can go, but you can't take these people with you. He's like, no, we all have to go because we all have to worship. Finally, he's like, okay, you can go, but you can't take your animals with you. Well, but we have to take all of our animals with us because we don't know what God is going to want. They're very, very aware of the fact that they have to offer sacrifice the way that God instructs them. Right? And so their whole purpose for leaving Egypt is so that they can worship the way that God asked them. He goes on and he says, Israel departs not in order to be a people like all others, it departs in order to serve God. And so the same can be said of us. That we come here, we come away from the world, as I mentioned in my homily last week, to worship God, not so that it'll look like everything else that we do, but so that it will look different. Because what we do here is different, it ought to look different. Right? And it's okay if we don't get it all. Because at the beginning of Mass we say that we are celebrating the mysteries of faith. And so it's okay and it's to be expected that we won't understand fully what we're doing. We should be coming to a greater knowledge of what's going on and better understanding our whole lives, but we will never fully grasp what we're doing. And so it's okay if we are in the dark, you want to say, because we are celebrating mysteries, things ought to be a little bit mysterious. Right? The second point now is that in order to get it right, and in order to get the liturgy right, we have to look to the church to ask what we ought to do. Right? To simply set aside what the church instructs about the liturgy, about music, about language, all of these things, is an incredibly dangerous thing because it gets us in the habit of being disobedient to church teachings. Right? And that's how we develop vice. By doing things over and over again. And so if we develop that vice of disobedience in little things, whenever we're posed with some incredibly difficult thing, it's going to be very easy for us to just say, well, I'm not going to do it. And so we can build up this virtue of obedience by doing the liturgy the way the Church asks. And then the last thing, Cardinal Ratzinger again. He has this wonderful article that you can find online called The Feeling of Things, the Contemplation of Beauty. It's fantastic if you want to nerd out for a little bit. But he's writing about icons. Icons, those more Eastern works of art that are two-dimensional, and so they're a little more plain than what we're used to. And so he says, an icon does not simply reproduce what can be perceived by the senses, but rather it presupposes a fasting of sight. Inner perception must free itself from the impression of the merely sensible, and in prayer and ascetical effort, acquire a new and deeper capacity to see, to perform the passage from what is merely external to the profundity of reality. He goes on and says, to admire the icons and the great masterpieces of Christian art in general leads us on an inner way, a way of overcoming ourselves. Thus, in the purification of vision, that is a purification of heart, it reveals the beautiful to us, or at least a ray of it. In this way, we are brought into contact with the power of the truth. And so back to that original question. Why do you speak to them in parables? Why do you speak to us in Latin and in chant? Because it forces us to look beyond the surface. It forces us to ponder deeply the things of God. It forces us through, as it says, a fasting, right? Through prayer and asceticism to develop a spirit that can see beyond the surface, that can come to know the truth more deeply and can come to recognize the beautiful in it.